Virgin Most Powerful Radio, sharing the gospel with clarity and charity.
And now, Virgin Most Powerful Radio is pleased to present Hands-On Apologetics with renowned Catholic author and apologist, Gary Michuta.
And welcome, everybody. Hands-On Apologetics. We are back in 2020, and it's great to be with you today. Hope you all had a wonderful and Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. And it's time for us to, reopen the dojo and start diving into this business of apologetics where the rubber of catechesis meets the road of everyday life. It's great to be with you today. Got an awesome show in store for you to kick off the year. We have our good friend Pat Flynn's going to be coming on. And he's going to be doing some book reviews. We're going to talk about some new books. For example, the new atheist Richard Dawkins has a book called Outgrowing God. And we're going to talk about the book, and we're also going to talk about some of the other new atheist books. And as you know, Pat himself was an ardent atheist, very well studied, and eventually left atheism, came into the Catholic Church along with his family, and it's always great to talk to him because he is definitely a man who has a wealth of knowledge, and he's just a lot of fun to talk to and lots of insight. So that's going to be coming up on the other side of the break. And as always, we're going to start our critical thinking skills, which today's Finding the Fallacy, by the way, is circular reasoning. And we've also made an early church father. Today's early church father is a biggie. He is St. Cyprian of Carthage. So got a lot in store for us today. Going to be a lot of fun. And by the way, if you have any questions for Pat Flynn, give us a call. Toll free at 888-526-2151. It's 888-526-2151. Or you can always email us your questions or comments at questions@handsonapologetics.com. And that email flies through the internet and lands in the dojo mailbox. And I do respond, by the way, to emails. Of course, with the holidays, the change in weather, I think everybody's been sick. And so I haven't been keeping up on all my emails. But so if you've emailed me over the holidays, trust me, I will eventually get to you. Just starting to get back in the swing of things. And eventually you will get the email response from me. So please keep them coming. Great emails, great comments, great suggestions. And by the way, I should give my shout-outs and welcome all of you watching live stream on Facebook and YouTube. Hello, everybody. Beautiful emoji explosion for the new year. Thank you. And also I want to welcome all of you listening through Catholic radio stations, other radio stations around the United States, and via podcasts around the world. Welcome aboard, everybody. It's great to be with you. And why don't we jump into our critical thinking exercise, shall we? Today's Finding the Fallacy is circular reasoning. Circular reasoning. Basically, what is circular reasoning? Well, it's a logical fallacy in which a reasoner begins with what he's trying to end with. In other words, he assumes the truth of his conclusion and then uses the truth of his conclusion as part of the evidence for the truth of the conclusion. And the components of circular reasoning are often logically valid, because the premises are true, but the problem is the conclusion's true only if the premises are true, and the premises are true only if the conclusion's true. Hence, we go around and around and around in a circle. This happens somewhat regularly. You can usually sense, there's this visceral sense when you're listening to somebody who's proposing a circular argument. You almost get dizzy trying to follow the logic. The classic is the Bible is inspired because it's the Word of God, and it's the Word of God because it says it's inspired. That's the classical circular reasoning usually out there. But, it can take all sorts of different forms. You could say the Catholic Church is true because it's infallible and it declares that it's true. So, of course, that makes perfect sense if, of course, you start off with an infallible church. The same thing's true with the Bible. If you start off with the Bible being the Word of God, then it's stating it's the Word of God would be true, but you can't anchor that back in the Bible. Otherwise, you go around in a circle. So the best way to defeat this fallacy is simply to point it out and call them out and say, okay, well, how do you know, for example, in our exercise, how do you know whether the Bible is the Word of God or whatever? You could use the Quran. You could use all sorts of things for circular reasoning. But, that's how you do it. You call it out. You make them say, okay, how can you prove it? And they have to prove it from a source other than the source they're trying to prove, obviously. And that's our finding the fallacy for today. A pretty simple one. I want to belabor the point, circular reasoning. All right, let's jump to the Meet the Early Church Father today. He is a biggie. He's a Latin father. It's St. Cyprian of Carthage. Carthage, of course, is a city in North Africa. Probably best known because it's close to the city of Hippo, where St. Augustine was bishop. St. Cyprian, Bishop of Carthage, he's often called the African Pope, by the way, although he's not, of course, the Roman Pope, but nevertheless, he was that great of a figure in North Africa. He was born at Carthage of wealthy pagan parents, and somewhere between the years 200 to 10 AD, he converted to Christianity somewhere around 246. He was raised to the priesthood soon afterwards, and in 248, 249, only a few years after becoming a priest, he was made Bishop of Carthage. When the Diocletian persecution broke out in 250, he found safety in the refuge of the hills outside the city, from where he, in comparative safety, he directed his flock via letters to his clergy. No doubt Cyprian's actions in taking safe refuge was prudent course of conduct. And he proved later that he wasn't a wimp. In fact, St. Cyprian would eventually become martyred. So it wasn't to avoid death, but rather it was to continue to care for his flock during this persecution. But his present conduct made him an easy target for barbs of his enemies, especially when he found it necessary to reprove a faction who wanted an immediate and easy reconciliation of the lapsed. In other words, during the persecution, some Christians were willing to burn the sacred books and repudiate the faith, and after the persecution, they wanted to be reconciled with the church. Well, those are the lapsed. So the lapsed wanted an immediate and easy reconciliation back with the faith, and they would point to Cyprian kind of running for the hills during the persecution as a way to ridicule, and kind of muscle them into allowing easy reconciliation. One of this faction, by the way, is the priest known as Novatus, who showed his bad faith when breaking with Cyprian, allegedly because Cyprian was not easy enough with the lapsed. He went to Rome and joined a sect known as the Novatians, who was an extreme rigorist in respect to the reconciliation of the lapsed, generally denying reconciliation entirely. So Cyprian was on excellent terms with Pope St. Cornelius I, but he fell out sharply with Cornelius' successor, who was Pope St. Stephen I, who reigned between AD 254 and 256, on the question of rebaptizing of converted heretics. It was an immemorial custom in North Africa to regard baptism conferred by heretics as invalid. And in spite of the Pope Stephen's severe warnings, Cyprian never yielded. His attitude was simply that every bishop was responsible for his own actions and answerable to God alone. And so the dispute over the rebaptism of heretics continued. This dispute was just at the dangerous stage when an edict from the Emperor Valerian, renewed the persecution measures against Christians and prevented it from ending in disaster. Pope St. Stephen I was martyred in 256 AD, and Cyprian was exiled in August of 257 AD. He was beheaded near Carthage on September 14th, 258 AD. He, by the way, is the first African bishop to die a martyrdom's death. We have a lot of St. Cyprian's writings that are still extant today. Like I said, they're in Latin. They're available in English. If you go to newadvent.org website, click on the Fathers tab, you can access many of the early church fathers' writings in English. There are a couple of very important works that we get from Cyprian. For example, he wrote a book on the unity of the Catholic Church sometime around AD 251 and 256, somewhere around there. In this treatise, he makes it very clear about the unity of the church is founded and stems from the chair of Peter. Okay, so the treatise of the unity of the church is primarily written around the year 251, but there was a second edition of the work, revised by Cyprian himself, somewhere in the year 255, 256. And this, of course, is where he has the falling out with Pope St. Stephen in regards to the baptism of heretics. And so he kind of rewrites some chapters, maybe sort of kind of downplaying a little bit the idea of the Roman primacy in this work. But nevertheless, the entire work is a wonderful work to read. Excuse me. Cyprian's also known for a large number of letters that he's written, and also his treatise on the lapsed. So in apologetics, we often appeal to St. Cyprian. But it's always good to know about that controversy with Pope Stephen in regards to baptism of the lapsed. Of course, the Orthodox faith is that baptism, even conferred by heretics, provided it's the right matter, form, and intent, is valid. So we do not rebaptize. We believe in one baptism for forgiveness of sins. And that is our Meet the Early Church Father for today, Cyprian of Carthage. And coming up on the other side of the break, Master Apologist Pat Flynn's going to join us. We're going to talk about some new writings by the New Atheist. Stay tuned, folks.
Welcome to our January 11th, 2020 Spiritual Warfare Conference. Every year without fail, this is our most popular, well-attended event. This year's Spiritual Warfare Conference will host Adam Bly, a Catholic demonologist, and an auxiliary member of the International Association of Exorcists, along with Dr. Luis Sandoval, a psychiatrist who's part of the Healing, Deliverance, and Exorcism team for the Diocese of Orange. These two gentlemen bring tons of experience and expertise in the area of spiritual warfare. This is going to be a high-information Catholic seminar. I'll be there as well, sharing some riveting stories on the diabolical and liberation found through Jesus Christ from my best-selling book, The Devil in the City of Angels. Mark your calendars, come and join us, and meet other radio hosts from Jesus 911. Contrary to popular belief, spiritual warfare is not demon-centered, it's Christ-centered. Come join us and learn how to armor up and fight the good fight of faith. Catholics, wake up. Don't hit the snooze button. Join us at St. Christopher Catholic Church, 629 South Glendora Avenue, West Covina, California, on January 11, 2020. See you then. Strength and honor in Jesus' name.
Psalm 119 says, "Your word is a lamp for my feet and a light to my path." According to St. John Paul II, being a Christian means saying yes to Jesus Christ. It consists in surrendering to the Word of God and relying on it, but also endeavoring to know better and better the profound meaning of this Word. May God grant that we always rely on His Word, read it often, and put it into practice.
Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show, and they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow, that's 80%. realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE, US 1.
Now, back to Hands-On Apologetics with Gary Machuda. If you'd like to join the conversation, call 888-526-2151. Here's Gary.
And welcome back, everybody. Hands on Apologetics. Well, since the terrorist attack on 9/11, there's been a growth of literature that is known as the New Atheism. And the New Atheists have been writing a lot of books. And recently, one of them, Richard Dawkins, has written a book called Outgrowing God. And to help us kind of work through this book and also some other books by the New Atheists, we have Master Apologist Pat Flynn with us. Pat Flynn, of course, is the host of the Pat Flynn Show that covers everything from fitness to mental health to business to writing philosophy and theology. He is a best-selling author, philosopher, fitness coach, musician, and entrepreneur who expounds the theory of generalism, a theory applicable to each and every one of us. And by the way, check out his website, ladies and gentlemen. It's www.chroniclesofstrength.com. And Pat, welcome back to the Hands on Apologetics.
Always a pleasure to be here, Gary. Thanks for having me on again.
Yeah, Happy New Year. And it's great to actually see your face now rather than just the audio.
Yes, Happy New Year to you. You inspired me to finally get a new setup for my podcast. So I went out because of your recommendation and got the webcam all set up. So hopefully people enjoy this. It's good to put a face to the voice when having these types of conversations.
It really is. It kind of drives you insane if you're a radio host because you're talking to the wall for an hour or so, and you have to be funny and entertaining to a wall. Very strange. It's a lot easier when you actually see the person you're talking to. So
I get it, too. It's easier to get the cues, too, when you can actually see the facial expression. So very good. Happy to be here.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we got together actually a few weeks ago and we're chatting about just different things we were up to. And boy, you're a busy person. In fact, you just appeared on A Journey Home with Marcus Grodi, EWTN. Do you have any idea when that's going to air?
Tonight. I just got the news that is going live tonight. And
awesome.
what's the date? It is the 6th. So 8 p.m. tonight, it goes up on EWTN. And then I think Matt, the producer, said that they should have the replay on YouTube probably by tomorrow. So I was thinking it would air a little bit later this month. So that was some fun, surprising news to see that in my inbox today.
Yeah, how providential. You're on the show and you're going to tonight. Awesome.
Yeah,
all
very
right.
Cool. So it was great. Thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, tune in, everybody. It's an incredible story if you haven't listened to Pat's story on the show here. So we were talking, and you mentioned that you were working through a book by Richard Dawkins called Outgrowing God. And so let's kind of tear that apart. It was a lot of fun talking to you about it. Who is Richard Dawkins, and how does this book fit into his other works?
Yeah, so Richard Dawkins, I guess, is one of the so-called four horsemen of this new atheist phenomenon. The other ones being Sam Harris, the late Christopher Hitchens, and Daniel Dennett. Now, Dawkins is very well known for being a biologist. I'm fairly certain he's retired at this point. But on a popular level, he's known for writing just very polemical books against religious belief, and specifically, he seems to really enjoy targeting Christian belief specifically. So, his most famous book would be The God Delusion. That came out, I believe, around 2006, and it was a huge bestseller. And the thing about these new atheists is they have had tremendous cultural impact. And we got to talking about some of their books, and I don't think I had very many nice things to say, except for the fact that most of them are mercifully short. So I haven't spent a whole lot of time with their work because I don't think there's really any good reason to. They're just not very substantive. They're actually pretty annoying. But unfortunately, they've had incredible cultural impact. So constantly, and they've really poisoned the nature of religious debate. So many of the slogans that you hear online now from the Village Atheists online and the YouTube Atheists are just typically taken verbatim from one of the textbooks of these new atheists, whether it's The End of Faith or The God Delusion. And part of the reason we brought up Outgrowing God is, I think there's some good news in that I think the new atheism is pretty much done. I think people are kind of over it, and it seems like the Jordan Peterson phenomenon has largely replaced that to some extent. And we could speculate why, but I think that is an accurate diagnosis of the situation. But still, they're out there. They're still kicking along. And Dawkins produced this new book, Outgrowing God, and it's specifically targeted at teenagers. It's like evangelical atheism for teenagers. So as unpleasant as some of these books are to read, I felt I had something of a duty to engage with this because they always sell exceptionally well. They always have a very large impact. So we might as well see what Dawkins has to say. Maybe he has some new arguments, and be prepared, because no matter what, we're going to encounter somebody who's been influenced by the work of the new atheist. So we should be equipped to deal with it. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, it's interesting. He's targeting youth to try to flip them to his side, I guess. I imagine according to his mind, that's the age where you give up your belief in the Easter Bunny and fairy tales and stuff, and so why not jettison God along with it?
Well, that's right. And in fact, one of his quotes early on in the book is he said, by about the age of 9, he realized that if he had grown up in some other country, he would be some different religion. So I think he came to his full enlightenment somewhere around the 1st or 2nd grade, and never decided whether a decision he made in the 1st or 2nd grade was actually a good one or worth reevaluating, which I found a little peculiar for an intellectual. You think that if you've settled on a position when you're 9 years old, it might be worth re-examining later on in life, but apparently not for Dawkins.
Yeah, no truer words have been spoken. I know, reflecting back as a 9-year-old, there was a lot of things I'm glad that I checked.
You'll have to excuse me if now people will see the eye rolls that I constantly give as we have to work through some of these passages. I just want to be very clear: is the new atheism does not represent atheism proper. And we've been on here. I've been on here before, and I've talked about my conversion experience, how I was very influenced by many of the old atheists and the existentialists. And there are many atheists who are intellectually serious. They really try to engage with the arguments. They're honest. They aren't polemical, or at least they're not generally polemical, and they need to be seriously contended with. And most of them are very, they're scholarly, they're patient, they're charitable. So they're everything the new atheism is not. And part of the problem with the new atheism is they kind of stain atheism in general, I think. Now, I'm obviously no longer an atheist, and I disagree with the atheistic worldview, but there's many good atheistic thinkers that need to be seriously contended with. And those are the thinkers that I tend to spend time with, not the new atheists. And the new atheists are kind of this, I don't know, they're kind of in the peanut gallery. No professional philosopher of religion takes any of these guys seriously that I know of. They're very petulant, they're very shrill, but for whatever reason, and I think it's just because they can sometimes be very funny and witty and clever, they've had immense cultural impact. And so you kind of have to you have to address them. You have to say, okay, well, what are they saying? And can we equip, at least people on a popular level with some good responses and some apologetic tools to be able to handle these objections, because they're bound to come up.
Yeah. And I think they kind of made it vogue where rather than refuting a position, you can make it ridiculous by ridiculing it. If you can make fun of something, then in a sense you've defeated that position. But the thing is, you can make fun of anything. You could make fun of some latest scientific theories. It's just a question of how clever you are and how witty you are.
That's right. I mean, there's many funny memes on both sides of the debate, right? Like you have the atheist, and he sees a gorilla, and you have to hold him back because he's like, "Yo, that's my uncle," and that's kind of funny. And we can lob insults and ridicule back and forth every day and see who's going to be funnier. But if we really want to be serious, we have to roll up our sleeves and see who's got the better arguments. But you make a really good point, is they really, certainly the vast majority of the new atheists, I don't even want to say they ignore the arguments, because to ignore something, I think, implies you have to first be aware of it. And I'm not even sure that they're even aware of the vast intellectual tradition surrounding at least classical theism. And if they're aware of it, they grossly misunderstand it. And their misrepresentations of it are just embarrassingly bad. So we're kind of in an awkward position here, because it's either they're just either really ignorant, which isn't good, or there's some type of malicious intent. They're intentionally misrepresenting the other position. They're not meeting their intellectual obligation to not only represent their opponent's position charitably, but also to make the most of it, right? And that's where somebody like St. Thomas Aquinas is a good example. Is he engages in what's now called steel manning. He not only states the opposite position, but he states the strongest possible version of it and then proceeds to systematically refute it. You just don't get anything like that in the New Atheists. And how you want to interpret that, I leave to the listener. Is that ignorance? Is that malice? Neither is a good option, but I think we're in an honest dilemma here.
Yeah. And this is something of a phenomenon I've noticed with other atheists outside of the New Atheism, is in a sense that they just believe that theism is so ridiculous that it's almost like they don't want to waste their time learning the other person's position. You know what I mean? So they'll just grab some superficial understanding and throw it up there and shoot it down as a straw man. Where you don't find the same thing on theism. I find theists are generally, very concerned about atheist arguments and interacting with them. Any idea why it seems to be one side rather than the other?
It's true. There is a real asymmetry there, and even in the professional level, I still believe that there's an asymmetry there. But absolutely on the popular level, there's and we could speculate why that is. It seems that a lot of what you see in the New Atheist books are atheists just from one generation passing slogans to another generation, and nobody wants to go back and look at the original sources and see, okay, is this what theists actually believe, right? And you read through a lot of the New Atheist books, and they'll critique, quote-unquote, arguments for the existence of God, but they don't cite anybody who's giving this argument on the theistic side. They'll just give their rendition of it. Famously, you'll see theists say that everything has a cause. Well, guess what? Then what caused God? But who has said that? What honest theist has ever made that argument? I can't think of a single one. So it's a total misrepresentation, and you see them just pass it back and forth. It's actually in Dawkin's newest book, and we can spend some time talking about that as we move through the conversation here. And there's a lot of hand waving. There's just a lot of sort of arrogant dismissal. There's also a lot of chronological condescension. Back in the day, people believed in God because they didn't have science, but now we have science and we know better. And they never really build out the argument. There's just a lot of assertions that happen. And you try and look at it in the form of a syllogism, and it's like the major premise is always omitted. And this is Christopher Hitchens was great at this in the sense that he would make a statement like this Catholic was an annoying hypocrite, which might be true. Therefore, all religion is false. And it's like, well, how did you draw that conclusion? But so it's like arbitrarily asserted, arbitrarily denied, my friend. Let's hear an actual argument. So you have poisoning the well, you have straw manning. I mean, these books are just museums of fallacies, and there is a severe asymmetry between theists and atheists. It seems like the theists are very serious about addressing problems from evil, problems from divine hiddenness, and being very systematic, and you just don't get that same honest treatment on the other side.
We have an exciting story for you to listen to. The story of John Pridmore. John Pridmore was a hitman for the gangs in East London.
I met some guys who seemed to have everything that I thought would make you happy. So I started working for these people. So to my shame, I was involved in vicious crime of all sorts.
He collected debts for the gangs, and if people didn't pay their debts, it was his job to kill them.
And as I drove home that night, I thought, what have I become that I could kill someone and not even care?
He was in the elevator on his way up to the 17th floor, and there was a 17-year-old young man in the elevator with him. Suddenly, this young man looked John right in the eye, and he said, "Jesus loves you."
And I said the first prayer I'd ever said. I said, up to now, all I've done is take from you, God. Now I want to give.
Within a year, by the grace of God, John was able to get out of the gang and be freed from this road to hell that he had been walking on. Go to Virgin Most Powerful YouTube channel and listen to this story today.
This is Terry Barber. I want to thank you for supporting Virgin Most Powerful Radio. And here's an easy way to support us by going to smile.amazon.com and type in Catholic Resource Center or Virgin Most Powerful Radio. And when you log in your Amazon account and you purchase products, a portion of it will go right back in supporting Virgin Most Powerful Radio. And it doesn't cost you a dime. I want to thank you ahead of time because that supports us year-round. May God bless you and your family. Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show. And they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow! That's 80%! realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
This is Jesse Romero. You're listening to Hands-On Apologetics with Gary Machuda on Virgin Most Powerful Radio.
And welcome back, everybody. We were chatting with Master Apologist Pat Flynn about, New Atheist writings, and the latest writing by Richard Dawkins, which is known as Outgrowing God. And Pat, that was a great synopsis, right before the break. And you have to give credit where credit is due. They're incredible writers, especially Dawkins. No one can turn a phrase like Dawkins, or pack a sentence with so much loaded language. It really is a kind of art form. But let's get into the particulars of the book.
Sure, yeah, and I will certainly agree. Dawkins, Hitchens as well. They're very enjoyable to read. They are funny. They are witty. Yeah. They are clever. He's a great prose stylist. I don't want to deny that. And I think that's part of why he's been so effective. It's rhetorically very effective, right? It bestirs the emotions. It gets people laughing. And when you can connect with people like that, you can have incredible impact. But you have to separate that from being philosophically sophisticated. Just because somebody's clever and witty, this is sometimes philosophers will often point out that the worst person to debate is a comedian, because they might have terrible arguments, but they're really funny and they're really charismatic. So you really can't compete with a comedian on a general level, because they just take people in with their sheer wit. And people aren't typically trying to evaluate whether an argument is valid or not. If you're making them laugh and you're effective at ridicule, you can have great impact there. So people, need to take a step back and just try to be a little bit more even-handed in the analysis, because when we actually look at Dawkins' book, it's bad. It's really, really bad. The arguments are incredibly weak. It's really the same tired cliches that we see over and again. So I figured maybe we'll spend some time just go through a couple of them, because they're pretty common. And this was what was disappointing about this book, was that despite the immense amount of criticism that Dawkins has received from both theists and atheists, I believe it was philosopher Michael Roos, who is himself an atheist, said at one point that the God delusion made him embarrassed to be an atheist. So the critiques come from both sides. And despite all this criticism, he just hasn't seemed to want to change his position. He hasn't seemed to want to update his arguments or slogans. He just keeps trotting them out time and again. So people can make of that what they will. But why don't we proceed here? You kind of already hinted at the first one, which I had written down here, and I'll quote from Dawkins. This is towards the beginning of his book. I had already worked out when I was about 9 years old that if I'd been born to Viking parents, I'd firmly have believed in Odin and Thor. And so this is a common cliche that you'll hear in the New Atheist. Sam Harris throws this one out a lot, is, hey, if you were born in Pakistan, you wouldn't be Christian, you would be Muslim. Or if you were born in some ancient country, you'd probably be whatever that pagan religion was or whatever. And the thing is, we could concede that. We could say, okay, yeah, maybe that's true. Like, that might actually be the case. But that in no way determines whether or not my religious belief is true. So this is often commonly called the genetic fallacy. And the reason this is a fallacy is you can't validate or invalidate the truth of a position by explaining how someone came to hold that position. So, for example, I might say, Gary, you only think that 2 + 2 = 4 because your math teacher taught you that. And everybody knows that she was a huge liar. And that might be true. She might have been a huge liar. But 2 + 2 still equals 4. Or, Gary, you might only be conservative or liberal because you grew up in this place or because you grew up in a conservative or liberal family, and that might be true. But that doesn't mean that you're wrong about the certain political policies that you hold to. And most of the time, you probably have other reasons why you hold to those specific affiliations or beliefs. C.S. Lewis had a good term for this. He often called it the fallacy of Bulverism, where you start to explain why something is wrong without first showing that it is wrong. And the only time that something like this would be interesting, whether we're looking from a historical perspective of how somebody came to hold a belief or a psychological perspective, is if we already have reason to believe that it's wrong. So, for example, if we have good arguments to show that atheism is false, then it might be interesting to look into psychological reasons why people might become atheists. For example, maybe they had an abusive father or something like that, right? So it works. These games work both ways. And I could say, well, look, you're only an atheist because you grew up in Portland, Oregon, right? So what are we going to make of this, right? At some point, we have to get beyond these simple fallacies and say, okay, well, what other reasons, independent reasons, do we have to either believe that Christianity is true or Islam is true or any religion or no religion at all? So you have to be very careful about this because in one sense, there might be some truth to this assertion, but as an argument against religion proper, it's completely invalid.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, so if he grew up in an atheistic, let's say the Soviet Union, somebody could say, well, you're an atheist because you grew up in the Soviet Union. I mean, what difference does that make?
Yeah, it doesn't make atheism true. And again, this is the thing that Dawkins arrived at when he was 9 years old and never thought maybe to re-examine that. Interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. So, okay. The genetic fallacy, I kind of picked up on that as well. And that's a very common slogan, It is. You'll find it in almost every, like I said, they pass these slogans back and forth. So you'll just find them worded a little differently, but typically you'll find the same ones throughout all the popular new atheist books. And then predictably, Dawkins soon trots out comparisons of God to Santa Claus and fairies, which again is nothing new with the new atheists. And this, again, really disappointing to see this, because how many times has he been critiqued by both theists and atheists alike for these silly arguments, yet now he's just presenting them to teenagers. So, I mean, what can we say in response to this? Well, one, it's a clear category error. And, what they'll often say is something based on evidence, right? It's like, well, or here's another way that they say it is, I only believe in one less God than you. That's the kind of like Ricky Gervais and Bill Maher objection. And the very funny thing about this particular objection is I know I mentioned in a previous episode, I was a big fan of H.L. Mencken, one of the old atheists growing up. Mm-hmm. You find the same thing even with him. He has an old essay called Memorial Service where he just kind of like lists all the gods of history that have been buried. And he's kind of like making this insinuation. But there's a couple ways that we can respond to this, and I think we can see pretty quickly that it's a very bad argument, right? So let's take the comparison to Santa Claus. The reason that I don't believe in Santa Claus is it is true that there's an absence of evidence for Santa Claus, but that absence of evidence is absent where I would expect it to be if Santa existed. So if Santa existed, I would expect some evidence, say, of some fat guy coming down the chimney at some point, or I would expect some evidence of his shop at the North Pole. And when I investigate these things, Santa is not there. The problem with this comparison to God is God in the classical theistic tradition is not a material, finite, limited being. God is the unrestricted, all-enveloping act of existence from whom and through which all finite, limited acts of being are created and have their existence, right? So then we have to ask, okay, if that God with a capital G existed, then what types of evidence would I expect? Well, I shouldn't expect that I would find him through a telescope or a microscope, because we just said that God is not a finite, physical, limited being, all right? So anybody who objects to the existence of God because you can't detect him empirically just has a fundamentally crude understanding of who God properly is, right? You just haven't done your homework. Secondly, I think the types of evidence we would expect are exactly the type of evidence that we encounter. One, that any contingent state of affairs exists at all, right? Which seems to imply that we need some type of necessary foundation, some eternal necessary foundation to explain that. The beginning of the universe, some 13.8 billion years ago, from no prior state of physical affairs. The exquisite fine-tuning of physics for the emergence of intelligent interactive life, which all of evolution depends upon.
Dawkins, by the way, near-death experiences, religious experiences, mystical experiences, or perception of an objective moral realm of moral values and obligations and duties. All this seems to me like just the kind of world that we would expect if God, properly understood with a capital G, exists. So the evidential question is the absence of evidence only counts as evidence of absence if we should expect some type of evidence and it isn't there. But once God is properly understood, virtually all the evidence we would expect is there. And then there's also the further evidence of revelation, specifically the claims of Jesus Christ, which I think just further tips the scales in favor of theistic belief, classical theism, and specifically Christianity. So the reason I believe in one less God than the atheist, but still one God, is because there's good reason to. There's good evidence for it. There's good arguments, right? So it's really silly, this objection. And the problem with these slogans is they only take 15 seconds to trot out, right? But it sometimes takes like 5 to 10 minutes to thoroughly examine them and explain why they're wrong, which is hard to do, when you're just going back and forth with village atheists on Twitter sometimes, because it requires somebody really wanting to have an honest discussion about these things rather than just engage in sloganeering. So that's a general response to that, but you can give other analogies too, right? A crime is committed, 100 people are suspected. Does the skeptic come in, clutching their copy of Skeptic magazine, say, look, I only believe in one less criminal than you guys. Let's let them all go. Well, no, you'd be like, a crime was committed. We have evidence that at least one of these people is a criminal, and maybe 99 are innocent. But there still seems to be like this one that fits the evidence really well. So I'm going with that. I'm not going to be an atheist with respect to this murder investigation.
Right. Yeah. I found that many times when they do look for evidence, it's almost like what they imagine the evidence would be if God existed. For example, well, I think if God existed, then every time somebody honestly has a prayer for something good, it should automatically be answered, or something like that. So it's really based on their imagination of how a God would act if he existed, and then when they don't find it, they conclude he doesn't exist.
Yeah, it really is interesting, isn't it? Because it's like, well, what religion makes that claim? And if a religion did make that claim, well, then it would be testable. But certainly that's not the Catholic faith, right? We believe that God won't answer any prayer that could potentially frustrate your salvation, right? That God will only what is ultimately good for you. And the point of prayer in the Catholic tradition is not to just get God to change his mind, right? It's to get us to conform our lives to the will of God. So again, it betrays a fundamental misunderstanding or a fundamental unwillingness to actually look into what are the religious beliefs? Like, what do Catholics actually believe before they start just lobbing out these ridiculous objections or assertions? Because I'll agree. Like, if some religion claims that if you pray, it will be answered immediately in 5 minutes, okay, then test that. Like that would be evidence against that particular religion. But certainly it's not evidence against the Catholic faith by any means. Right. So I think we're perfectly secure against that objection.
Yeah, please don't tell me that he did the flying spaghetti monster again.
I think we kind of got it with Odin and Thor, but it's the same thing with the flying spaghetti monster. People are like, well, why couldn't God be a flying spaghetti monster? People will throw that out. Well, if the classic arguments for God have force, right, and God isn't a finite physical material being, well, whatever has noodly appendages is a finite physical material being. We can rule that ridiculous caricature out.
This is Matthew Arnold for Virgin Most Powerful Radio. This March, VMPR, in association with the Catholic Resource Center, will be hosting a special conference for the Adoramus Society. Adoramus at the Triduum, a conference on the spirituality of the Triduum liturgies, featuring speakers Father Joseph Fessio, Dr. Anthony Lillis, and Christopher Carstens, addressing such topics as developing a liturgical spirituality, the spirituality of Holy Thursday, the spirituality of Good Friday, and the spirituality of the Paschal Vigil and Easter season. It all takes place March 14th, 2020, at the historic Sacred Heart Chapel at 381 West Center Street, Covina, California, 91723. You can register online at vmpr.org or call now at 877-526-2151 to reserve your seat today. for adoramus at the Triduum. In Luke 7, Jesus said, "I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven her, because she has been shown great love." According to St. John of the Cross, Christians should always remember that the value of their good works is not based on number and excellence. Their value is based on the love for God that prompts them to do the works. May we always be motivated by true love for God and not worry so much about what we do, but why we do it.
Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show. And they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow! That's 80%! realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
Now, back to Hands-On Apologetics with Gary Machuda. If you'd like to join the conversation, call 888-526-2151. Here's Gary.
And welcome back, everybody. We're chatting with Master Apologist Pat Flynn of The Pat Flynn Show, and you can check out all his great stuff at his website, www.chroniclesofstrength.com. And tonight, if you tune into the Journey Home on EWTN, you'll get to see Pat give his story with Marcus Grodi, so definitely check that out. So, Pat, I know there's been a lot of great books written by theists, like Edward Fazer's book, Michael Ogren's, Robert Delfino, and does Dawkins interact at all with any of the theistic arguments in this book?
Not that I've found. I mean, famously in The God Delusion, he gives a 2-page summary presentation of Aquinas's 5 ways and just grossly misunderstands and misrepresents them. But it seems like he's more interested in this, which let's give Dawkins credit, because that's generally like 2 to 3 pages more than most of the atheist writers will dedicate to somebody like Thomas Aquinas. It's just such a shame that and I mean, we have to take kind of a step back as well, and just, I don't care what side of the debate you're coming on or coming from, Aquinas is often regarded as one of the most brilliant men to have ever lived. Some people would say he's the most brilliant. Usually he makes like the top 5 or 10 of most influential thinkers in history. And yet we're supposed to believe that essentially these new atheists, one of whom is just a reporter with no background in philosophical or training or theology or science, Christopher Hitchens, we're supposed to believe that this is the guy who's put the final nail in the coffin of the religious debate. And that's often what I find is I'll be having a conversation with somebody online about religion, and it's productive, and somebody will come in and say, obviously you guys haven't read God is Not Great by Christopher Hitchens. And I mean, it's just the arrogance that comes from the type of vitriol that has been spilled out by these new atheists, to think that this guy has had the final say in the religious debate, which is a debate of enormous history, of people of the highest intellect weighing in on this debate. But he somehow refuted it with objections so babyish that my 6-year-old could respond to him. And that's the end of the debate right there. You just have to kind of like take a step back and realize how ridiculous it all sounds when some of these assertions are made. But I think the other thing that we find with the new atheists is that they are obsessed, absolutely obsessed, with thinking that the classic theistic argument is just everything has a cause, therefore God must exist. And they think that they can absolutely devastate this by raising the objection of, okay, well, what caused God? Now, the obvious problem there is that is not an argument from any reputable classical theist that I can think of. Not a single one can I think of has ever made, and certainly not Aquinas, has ever made an argument of that sort. In fact, Aquinas would say precisely the opposite, that not everything could have a cause, right? And we can motivate this through a simple thought experiment. We can think, could anything have caused everything? And that seems absurd. Like, could anything have caused reality? Well, no, because anything outside of reality is nothing. So we would just say that nothing caused reality, or that reality was dependent on its existence on nothing, which would mean that reality wouldn't exist. So like the people who really think about this realize that that's a really stupid thing to say. And so they don't say it. That isn't the argument. But the new atheists are just absolutely insistent on pretending that that's the argument. So they constantly just battle this straw man, this caricature of an argument for God that no serious theistic philosopher ever presents. And we have it again in throughout his newest book, Outgrowing God. You see this same objection raised of what caused God. And so in a recent review that I for people who are interested, I wrote a fuller review of this book for Word on Fire. I actually go a little bit on the offensive, and I look back at Dawkins' central argument in the God delusion and address the who caused God objection, and also show that his central argument for atheism is incredibly weak in and of itself. So maybe we could take a look at that, but I just wanted to throw those few observations out there as well.
Yeah, I was just curious because there's been so much material. In fact, I think Ed Fazer in 5 Proofs for the Existence of God actually tries to investigate the historical background of that misunderstanding about, everything has a cause. It's funny how he seems just totally oblivious to, these pretty learned responses to his work.
Yeah, when I talk to Ed on my podcast, I mean, he gets really annoyed. This is like a huge pet peeve of his. And like, I can understand. It annoys me too. It's like, this is not the argument. And again, this is like, you will never see them quote, an original source on this. It's always their presentation of what they say the argument is. So that should always make somebody a little bit suspicious. So I can understand Dr. Fazer's annoyance there, because it's one of those vampire objections or those vampire myths. It doesn't matter how many times you address it. It just keeps coming up again and again and again. It just never goes away.
Yeah. There's no wooden stake you could drive through it. It's hard.
Unfortunately not.
Yeah. So he doesn't respond to any of the substantive arguments then. Well, then what does his book address outside of just throwing out the same slogans and?
Well, not really, because it's kind of like the God delusion light or the God delusion for teenagers. So that's why I thought it would be useful in this review. Well, okay, let's try and steelman Dawkins. Let's go back to his God delusion and see what his central argument is. We'll quote it verbatim. We won't take him out of context, and we'll see if it holds up. We'll see if his central argument succeeds. So, shall we do that, Gary? Shall we dive into that?
Sure. Why not?
Okay,
yeah, we got about 5 minutes. So.
Yeah, all right. We'll see if we can just quickly diffuse it. All right. So this is from this now is from the God Delusion. People can just look this up of themselves if they want to waste some money on that book. Step 1. One of the greatest challenges to the human intellect has been to explain how the complex and probable appearance of design in the universe arises. Step 2. The natural temptation is to attribute the appearance of design to actual design itself. Step 3, the temptation is a false one because the designer hypothesis immediately raises the larger problem of who designed the designer. So there's your classic who caused God objections snuck in there. Step 4, the most ingenious and powerful explanation is Darwinian evolution by natural selection. Step 5, we don't have an equivalent explanation for physics. Step 6, we should not give up the hope of a better explanation arising in physics. Something as powerful as Darwinism is for biology. Conclusion, therefore, God almost certainly does not exist. Now, I'm not going to be saying anything new here because this argument has been taken to task by countless philosophers and theologians over the years. But I think there's a few points that are worth reiterating. The first is that this is just formally invalid. Taken as a deductive argument, there are 0 known laws of inference that would allow you to draw that conclusion from the steps that Dawkins has given. So we have a patently invalid argument here, and the conclusion just kind of like comes completely out of nowhere, right? And if we're trying to be charitable, okay, maybe he doesn't mean this is a deductive argument. Maybe it's Dr. William Lane Craig has pointed this out. Maybe it's sort of like a cumulative case. Well, in that sense, the most we should conclude from this argument is we shouldn't make an argument for God's existence from biological science. Is the absolute most that we could conclude from this argument. But as Dawkins sort of admits in this argument is Well, we still have the difficulty of physics, because biology, for evolution to occur, depends on a very special type of universe, a universe that appears to be exquisitely fine-tuned for the emergence of interactive, intelligent life. So the debate just isn't settled there. If anything, it's just kicked to a more fundamental level. And that is, for people who are interested in teleological arguments, that's kind of like where the bleeding edge of the debate is right now, is in physics, and especially the fine-tuning constants and quantities in physics. So evolution assumes a very special universe. So it's kind of beside the point. But there's other holes we can poke in this argument very quickly here. Another thing that Dr. Craig points out is that premise 3 here is obviously false, right? We don't need I think this is a good point. Even if you thought God did need an explanation, it would be wrong to assume that you need to explain the explanation before that is a good explanation. So, for example, it's chilly in my basement right now because my air conditioner is on. And that seems like a really good explanation. But I don't and that remains a good explanation, even if I don't know who turned the air conditioner on, even if I don't know who built the air conditioner. It just seems like the air conditioner is the best explanation for why my basement is chilly right now. And same thing here. If all the evidence and arguments point to God as the best explanation, even if God needed an explanation or cause, which we would hold in classical theism that he doesn't and he can't, or if he has an explanation, that explanation is found in the necessity of his nature, right? But certainly he doesn't have an external cause. But even if that was the case, that still wouldn't mean that God couldn't be the best explanation for all the arguments and evidence that we have. So between it being patently invalid and certainly one of the premises demonstrably false, it just goes to show that Dawkins' arrogance here is just completely unjustified. And I want to try and finish with a charitable note of some kind when talking about these new atheists, but I struggle because, and I don't want to seem overly harsh, I do try not to be polemical, but when we say that Dawkins just is embarrassingly inept, I can't think of any other way to describe his work without being inaccurate. So,
yeah. Well, you're not alone. It's not only theists but atheists that have been very critical about that his arguments are a mile wide and an inch thick, if that.
But the difficulty here is, like we said at the beginning, is he sells a lot of books. He sells a lot of books. He's had enormous influence. So you hear these slogans trotted out again and again and again. And now that we know that he's targeting the youth, what are we going to do? We have to read his. Unfortunately, we have to read his stuff. Right?
Yeah, that's true.
We have to equip ourselves. We can't ignore it, because even if we see, okay, this is really bad stuff, it has had a major impact. It's quote unquote converted a lot of people to new atheism, and it's something that needs to be dealt with. So hopefully this has given. If anybody, thought that the new atheists pose any type of serious threat to religion, hopefully this has diffused that tension. I mean, Dawkins, all the new atheists, I really see them as sort of toothless tigers. They're not really serious intellectual threats by any means. And the more we can convey that, especially to younger generations who've really been taken in by them, the more we can counterpunch, and focus on substance. I think we'll be doing a decent service there, and the new atheism will continue to fade away.
Yeah, very good. Well, hey, tell us a little bit about Chronicles of Strength. How can people get a hold of your articles, your podcast, all the great stuff you do?
Surely. chroniclesofstrength.com is my website. My podcast is the Pat Flynn Show, and you can find that on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, all the major outlets there. If you're into kettlebells and fitness, you can grab my free ebook. I have just 101 sort of time crunch kettlebell workouts for busy professionals who just want to get in a good workout in a short amount of time. And that is at the website 101kettlebellworkouts.com.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Always a pleasure, Gary. Thank you.
All right. That's Pat Flynn, ladies and gentlemen, of chroniclesofstrength.com. Check it out. Also, check out Journey Home tonight. It's going to be on, and you'll get to hear his story. And, man, this is the fastest hour in Catholic Talk Radio. It just flies. Coming up next, High Impact Catholic Talk coming at you with the Terry and Jesse Show. And it's time for me to shut down the Midwest Command Center here, turn off the dojo lights. Thank you so much for listening, folks. And God willing, we'll talk again soon. Bye-bye, everybody.
In the 1990s, I lived and worked in Hollywood. But when my wife Betty's mom took ill, we relocated to Orange County. And it was during this time in our lives that I converted to Catholicism. Once my eyes were opened to the truth, I couldn't learn enough about the faith. But I had less free time than ever, especially with a long commute. That's when I discovered the real value of Catholic audio. Listening to cassette tapes transformed my daily commute into a miniature retreat. And that's the beauty of Virgin Most Powerful Radio today. Since the podcasts are archived, you can listen anytime on our smartphone app. I know how listening to Catholic audio can bring you closer to Christ and His Church. So I encourage you to visit the App Store or go to vmpr.org and download the app today. It just might change your life. I'm Matthew Arnold for Virgin Most Powerful Radio.